Today, I will present briefly the first major disinformation operation that targeted the United States. So I'm writing a history of disinformation right now, and a lot of that history plays out in the Cold War. And then as the Soviet Union goes down and the internet goes up, it obviously changes its nature and turns digital. And there are a couple of fascinating cases, obviously, in Ukraine that haven't been covered in the press at all, not even in Ukraine. But I'm going to take you way back today, even before the Cold War, to 1930. And just briefly, the context. One of the books I read for my research was written by Herbert Romerstein. Some people may recall the name. He was a State Department, he was running the counter-disinformation unit in the State Department in the late 1980s. Herbert Romerstein, a legend, essentially the Bellingcat of his day. He co-authored a book with a Soviet defector, Levchenko, in which they describe this operation that I'm going to mention. It's the only time it's mentioned. There's no historian who has ever covered this story. This is completely fresh research. But Romerstein from the State Department and the ex-KGB guy who did active measures, Levchenko. So I read the story and I'm like, this makes no sense. You guys get it completely wrong. You get your attribution wrong. You're missing key details here. So I said, okay, let's do this again. Go back to the primary sources and get to the bottom of what happened here. And I'm going to present to you what I found today. So briefly, the context. We're looking at, this is New York. The entire story plays out in Manhattan, including the production of the forgeries. This Manhattan in 1930, late 1929, the Great Depression is beginning. It's a very intense moment in the history of the United States and, of course, New York. You have prohibition, and there's some good partying happening in the city at the time. And at the same time, you have unemployment rising. This is a picture actually from D.C. from 1930. And you have communism actually spreading in the sort of far left worker movement spreading in the United States. So it's a time of polarization, a little bit comparable to today. And in that context, in March in 1930, there's a massive demonstration worldwide. It's the day. It's called the Unemployment Day, and you have a breakout of violence. People die across the Western world, and very quickly the idea makes the rounds in the U.S. but also in Europe that the Soviet Union, the young Soviet Union, it's only 8 years old at that point in time, is interfering with these protests. It's essentially fomenting violence in the West. The Third International, the Global Revolutionary Organization at the time, founded by Lenin, was supposed to be behind this. So that's the context for what happens next. This is a picture of one of these large New York demonstrations. And the New York Times, covered all of this in detail. This is big news of the day. What happens next is Grover Whalen, the gentleman with the mustache there, is sworn in as the NYPD commissioner, and he very quickly, he's a showman, has a bit of a populist streak, and he very quickly escalates, hires more people in the NYPD, buys more arms, mounted units, and horses trampling over protesters. It's a pretty brutal time there. This is a picture from one of the units, so what happens next is Grover Whalen here again. As I said, he's a showman. He was very good at not just using force but also showing what he did, and used reporters to get the word out of what he did at these demonstrations, which put him under pressure. So now the forgery comes in. Grover Whalen, head of NYPD, is under political pressure because he's too brutal and too violent in countering these, what he calls communist demonstrations. And everybody is sort of waiting for evidence to show that the Soviets actually control the demonstrations in the United States. His name is Bogdanov. He's the head of an American, he's a Russian, knows all the big names in Moscow, in the Cheka, and in the Politburo. He's in New York at the time, heading UMTORG, which is the Soviet trade organization, basically an unofficial Soviet representation in New York. And suddenly this letter pops up out of nowhere, which is allegedly written by him, instructing to him. Sorry, it's written to him and instructing his organization from Moscow to escalate, listing 30 agents that Moscow has sent to New York in order to escalate the situation on the ground, and the United States more broadly. Then what happens next is Grover Whalen, here's the press conference from that day. That picture was insanely hard to find. Grover Whalen shows the press these letters that implicate the Russian government in controlling and in subversion and sabotage in the United States. And this blows up. Huge news story. So, Red Scare in the US, Moscow alleged fomented strikes and riots, 30 communist agents sent to New York. It's international news. There's so many stories covering this situation. And very quickly, of course, UMTORG, the Soviets, deny that they ever did this. So the situation is getting quite confusing. Grover Whalen, the government says one thing, everybody else, the Soviets say another thing. And of course, in the spirit of the time, the credibility is with the NYPD and not so much with the Soviets. So, widely called just Reds at the time already. It's a very anti-communist atmosphere in New York. But what happens is that the next thing that happens is that a congressional inquiry, the House, sets up a special committee to investigate communist red propaganda operations in the United States. So the congressional committee gets underway, it's known as the Fish Committee, and starts investigating what actually happened. At the same time, as this is going on, you have investigative, this is Fish, Hamilton Fish, who heads the committee. At the same time, you have journalists, investigative journalists, trying to get to the bottom of what happened. And one guy working for the Evening Graphic in New York is particularly inventive as a journalist, as an investigator. This, by the way, is a moment in history where journalists carry police badges that are fake and walk and show them to people in order to get better sources. It's kind of a wild time for investigations, which makes the story quite interesting. So this guy from the Evening Graphic basically says, okay, we have this Russian language alleged forgery that's making the rounds here in New York. There are only so many Russian language print shops that can produce that kind of thing in New York. So he basically went to the phone book and visited all the print shops. There are not too many, a handful. And he was showing them a copy of the letter. And in one print shop, the printer basically says, oh yeah, sure, I printed this. This is my work. And he's like, bingo. This is produced in New York with a Moscow dateline. So all that comes out in that hearing, which is an amazing thing to happen. So next question is, who did it? Who was actually behind it? If it's a forgery, that's how print shops looked like at the time. And the print shop forensics that we have on this case are essentially the 1930s equivalent to metadata today, which really are metadata. So let's go into that for a moment. I was able to track down a copy of the original forgery, of all places, in a Yiddish newspaper. It's the only newspaper that printed the actual original. And you see them on the front page. This is the forward from the 3rd of May, 1930. This is the forgery itself. And if you zoom into the letterhead, I'm not sure I have a pointer here. Let's try this. Yeah, you can see the executive committee of the Comintern. There's the Moscow dateline with dated. So this is pre-printed on the letterhead. There's a Moscow phone number on the letterhead. Also, again, Moscow street address on the letterhead. This is printed in the East Village, 10th East Street, the print shop. And here, this line is the most interesting one. It's a American Secretariat. But it's almost illegible. Alex Gostev helped me decipher this, formerly from Kaspersky. I found that particularly nice detail. Anyway, so this line is highly revealing because the Russian typeset that the printer used was damaged, which is why the ink smeared in that line. And he explained that in detail. That's why he says, beyond reasonable doubt, that he printed this. Also, he made up the entire design. So because of the smeared ink here, and because of the context of what the printer provided, we can conclude with very high confidence that this is actually work that was done in his print shop. So the next question is, who did it? This is LaGuardia, then later mayor of New York, is involved in that story as well, because he made public that finding from that print shop. So the next question is, who was behind this? Who was behind this operation? And in order to understand who is behind this operation, we can't just look at the detailed technical forensics, as is also the case today. We have to look at the broader geopolitical context. So this is 1930, and Russia, the Soviet Union, is a new country after 10 years after the revolution, after the Civil War. And what happened after the Civil War in 1920 is that 2 million conservative Russians basically left Russia. The white emigres, or monarchists, many of them. And so they fled, many of them, to China, to the United States, to Paris especially, to Berlin, and to London. And they opposed the recognition of the Soviet Union as an independent country. They wanted counter-revolution. They wanted to go back to the monarchy, to Tsarist times. So in 1927, 3 years before the story plays out, the Soviets are confronted with so many anti-Soviet forgeries that they publish a book about anti-Soviet forgeries. I mean, that's how much forging was going on at the time. So we know that there were several white Russian publications out of New York, and the person who walked into that print shop ordering the forged letterhead was also working for one of these white Russian newspapers at the time, as a janitor of all things. So I think we can say with, I would say, moderate to high confidence that this is a white Russian forgery designed to undermine the recognition of the Soviet Union, which is really an amazing situation. This is just a picture of one of the key figures of the Russian emigration, General Wrangel, who is not directly involved in the operation, but just to give you a bit of an illustration of the quite militarized structure of the counter-revolutionaries. So what's the takeaway here? Let me just give you, and I'll close with that, 3 quick takeaways. One I already mentioned. Forensics alone will, in this case, were not sufficient to get to the bottom of what actually happened. You really have to understand a lot about the wider geopolitical context. And I could, as I was reconstructing the case, it sort of, initially I was going in through a tunnel view, and then I had to slightly enlarge my perspective. So I could literally see how my understanding improved as I was including more and more Russian history from the time. That was a fascinating experience, actually. The second related lesson is the Fish Committee that I mentioned was highly politicized. The committee was started to investigate communist propaganda, but they found anti-communist propaganda. So they were not set up in terms of their political expectations to actually deal with the reality that they found. They wanted to find the opposite. So they never actually came to any conclusion on this, and the story was never really covered. So even at the time, if you read the New York Times every day, you would not know really what actually happened, which is related to the second finding that I think is amazing. The forgery is really badly done, if you think about it and look at it in detail. But because it was partly exposed very quickly as a forgery, was unclear who did it, but it was exposed as a forgery, it developed more of an impact. So partial exposure, and this was a very clear takeaway for a lot of people at the time, for the Soviets at the time, partial exposure is actually a good thing. And there are many, many cases that come later where partial exposure is really built in. Even CIA makes that experience in the 1950s, that partly exposing an operation can enhance the operation. The third takeaway, the final takeaway that I just quickly wanted to highlight is that this operation in a way foreshadows the future of active measures for quite some time to come. In the sense that what the White Russian forgers did was to articulate a fear that a lot of people had already. The fear was that the Soviet Union, the Comintern, and the Third International was controlling, fomenting violence in New York. And that Amtorg, this Russian organization with Bogdanov as its head, was a tool of the Soviet Union. Now that was accurate. That was actually happening. Just not exactly how the forgery described it. But so the takeaway here is if you run a forgery, if you run a disinformation operation or an info op really, the most effective way to do it is to take something that has roots in reality, that's not completely made up, and that a lot of people believe in. The two can be separate, by the way, but those are the two components. Use something that is accurate and use something that has real emotional resonance, and then run with it. And the forgery, in a sense, will be believed by a lot of people. So ultimately, Grover Whalen, the NYPD commissioner, fell and had to step down as a result of the affair. But I would consider it nevertheless a success. The final irony is that one of the people who did the forgery, most likely, wrote a piece in the New York Times a couple of months later blaming the Soviets for the forgery. And he came up with a reason. He said, basically, listen, they wanted to get rid of, they basically wanted to undermine the credibility of all documents that would come out in the future so that we couldn't believe anything anymore. They wanted to turn us into cynics. I mean, this is quite twisted. The argument here that they wanted to turn us into cynics, of course, was fake as well. So this hall of mirrors where you come up with fakes to defend initial fakes was really quite far developed already in 1930. So I'll stop here and we can talk about some more recent, more technical stuff. Thank you very much.
So what is kind of like the impact of the initial story versus later on when it's discovered to be a forgery? Like, does that end up getting the same sort of coverage and acceptance as the initial leak? Or is it one of those things where this is the first thing we hear about, it's automatically true, some smaller number of people later on discover that this is fake, it should not be believed, but the larger public narrative remains that this is in fact the truth? Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer in hindsight, because obviously I can't interview people on that case, only look at newspaper coverage. Judging from the newspaper coverage and the frequency and the number of articles, I would think, yes, the initial story got more press than the congressional committee, for example, but it got a fair amount of press afterwards as well. So difficult to say. Probably both what you're describing. Some people considered the red remote control as true, others didn't. So it really added confusion. Well, I don't see any other questions. Sorry, this is quite far, coming quite far from left field, so to speak here, but I appreciate your attention. Thank you.